You probably think you already understand the business model of a Prohibition-era speakeasy. A hidden room, a strong drink, a cop on the take, and easy money for whoever kept the door locked from the outside and open from the inside. That is the version popular culture sold back to us. Velvet curtains, jazz, quick fortunes. But if you had actually tried to run one between 1920 and 1933, the romance would have disappeared very fast. The real story was buried in the ledgers, the delivery routes, and the nightly cost of keeping one illegal door open. By 1930, historical estimates put American bootleggers' annual earnings at roughly $3 billion. $3 billion. In a country that had supposedly outlawed the trade entirely. To understand why that happened, you have to start before the first password at the first speakeasy door. Before national prohibition took effect in January 1920, alcohol was not some fringe commodity. It was embedded in the tax system, in urban nightlife, in restaurant culture, in working-class leisure, in middle-class dining, and in local politics. Tax historians note that before the federal income tax, alcohol taxes supplied roughly 30 to 40% of federal revenue. Then came the 16th Amendment in 1913, which made income tax a much larger federal pillar, and only after that did a national alcohol ban become financially plausible. World War I pushed the politics further. Anti-German sentiment hurt brewers, grain conservation arguments gained traction, and the Anti-Saloon League pressed its advantage. Congress passed the Volstead Act over Woodrow Wilson's veto. The 18th Amendment supplied the constitutional ban. On January 16, 1920, the country went dry. Officially. Unofficially, the demand barely disappeared. Economist Clark Warburton later estimated that alcohol purchases by the late 1920s may have been only about 20% below the pre-war years of 1911 through 1914. That is not abstinence. That is a market shock. So the question is not why speakeasies existed. The question is how an illegal bar stayed in business at all. How do you make money selling a product that can be seized, in a room that can be raided, through a supply chain full of thieves, informants, and poison? The answer comes down to three numbers. First, acquisition cost, what it took to get drinkable liquor into the building. Second, protection cost, what it took to keep police, federal agents, and rivals from shutting you down. Third, customer yield, how much money you could extract from each patron once they were inside. Every successful speakeasy, from a basement blind pig to an exclusive Manhattan club, was just a different way of balancing those three numbers. Supply, protection, yield. Start with the cheapest version of the business. The neighborhood backroom. The apartment beer flat. The cellar joint behind an unmarked door. This was the low-capital speakeasy, and in some ways it was the purest economic form of the trade. It had almost no fixed investment beyond rent, furniture, glassware, a lookout, and a source of liquor. Sometimes not even much furniture. New York Municipal Archives described the overwhelming majority of speakeasies not as glamorous clubs, but as seamy, down-market places tied to scams, robberies, assaults, and prostitution. Police Commissioner Richard Enright complained that federal prohibition laws had neither the support nor the respect of the public. That mattered. A business becomes easier to run when a large share of your customers do not think they are morally in the wrong. But that cheap room had a brutal problem. Inventory. Beer was bulky. Wine spoiled. Both were harder to transport, harder to hide, and far less efficient per square foot of smuggling space. Spirits won the black market for a simple reason: concentration. More alcohol in less volume. Easier to move. Easier to conceal. Hard liquor turned risk into something compact. That is why economic historians found a major potency shift during Prohibition. Prices rose across the board, but not equally. One prominent estimate found beer prices up more than 700%, brandy up 433%, and spirits up 270%, which sounds backwards until you remember the transport math. A case of whiskey carried better margins than the same space filled with beer. Rigid rule, hard constraint. So a speakeasy owner buying from a local bootlegger was already working inside a distorted market. Higher risk rewarded stronger liquor. That changed the menu, the customer experience, and the health consequences. It also encouraged dilution. Good whiskey could be cut with water. Poor whiskey could be disguised. Bathtub gin could be flavored. And the easiest way to hide bad liquor was the cocktail. Ginger ale, Coca-Cola, lemon, sugar, mint, fruit juice. What later got remembered as the stylish cocktail culture of the 1920s was also, very often, a quality control workaround. Here's what nobody told you about the low-end speakeasy. For many operators, the ideal bottle was not the finest bottle. It was the bottle least likely to bankrupt the house before midnight. That pushed owners toward increasingly dangerous supply. By about 1922, much of the stock of pre-Prohibition whiskey had been exhausted or diverted. Industrial alcohol became the next reservoir. According to Treasury-era accounts summarized by later historians, the federal government was overseeing around 90 million gallons of industrial alcohol in the mid-1920s, with about 6 million gallons reserved for medical and research use, while officials believed bootleggers were grabbing about 10 million gallons for illegal reconditioning. That alcohol had been denatured, meaning poisoned or fouled, so it could be used in industry rather than drunk. Bootleggers tried to reverse the process in illegal stills. They could not do it completely, not chemically, not reliably. So the low-end speakeasy faced a recurring decision. Pay more for smuggled or relatively better liquor and charge accordingly. Or buy cheaper industrial stock, redistill it, mix it, and hope the customers either did not notice or did not die fast enough to ruin the week's receipts. Some of them did die. In New York in 1926, historical accounts report roughly 750 people died after drinking wood alcohol-laced liquor. On New Year's Day 1927, Bellevue Hospital was jammed with cases and 41 people died. In Philadelphia, 307 died in that January wave. Chicago recorded 163. Treasury seizures in New York in 1927 found that 98% of the 480,000 gallons of liquor seized contained poisonous additives, and samples taken from 55 city speakeasies showed traces of wood alcohol. Not a typo, 98%. And there was another pressure on the same business: legal alcohol loopholes. Under the Volstead framework, doctors could prescribe up to 1 pint of liquor every 10 days. The patient typically paid about $3 to the doctor and another $3 to the pharmacist. So for roughly $6, a consumer could acquire government-approved whiskey through a medical fiction. That loophole became an industry of its own. Historical pharmacy records estimate that 15,000 prescribers applied for permits in just the first 6 months of Prohibition, and later estimates put annual alcohol prescriptions at around 11 million. Walgreens grew from 20 stores in 1920 to 525 by 1929, with medicinal liquor sales part of the story. So even an illegal bar was not simply competing with other illegal bars. It was competing with pharmacies, sacramental channels, home production, and private drinking parties. Which brings us to the second number: protection cost. A speakeasy did not need perfect secrecy. That is one of the strangest parts of this entire system. It needed manageable enforcement. There is a difference. If everyone in the neighborhood knew where the place was, but the local police were paid, the federal agents were underfunded, and the customers were discreet enough, the business could survive for years. Federal enforcement began weak and stayed stretched. The government initially funded only around 1,500 agents for the whole country. They were supposed to police roughly 12,000 miles of shoreline, nearly 3,900 miles of borders with Canada and Mexico, a vast flow of industrial alcohol, tens of thousands of commercial stills, and potentially 22 million American households capable of fermenting alcohol at home. By any conventional analysis, the dry system should have controlled the market. It didn't. Part of the reason was arithmetic. Part of it was corruption. Agent salaries generally range from about $1,200 to $3,000 a year. That is not much when the people you are policing are sitting on black market margins inflated by the law itself. By the end of 1921, 100 agents in New York alone had reportedly been dismissed for taking bribes related to legal alcohol permits. By 1930, more than 1,500 federal prohibition employees had been fired for offenses ranging from bribery and embezzlement to robbery and perjury. So when a speakeasy owner budgeted for rent, liquor, and staff, there was usually an unprinted line item underneath all of them: protection. For a middle-tier speakeasy, this is where the real business started to resemble a normal urban service firm, just with a legal risk baked into every transaction. You paid for a room. You paid for a bartender. You paid musicians if you wanted a better crowd. You paid for a doorman who knew faces and passwords. You paid for a lookout. You paid to change entrances, hide stock, or create escape routes. At the famous 21 Club in Manhattan, the owners had an architect build a camouflage door, a hidden wine cellar behind a false wall, and a bar rigged so that liquor bottles could be dropped down a chute and shattered out of sight during a raid. That was capital expenditure. Expensive, yes, but maybe cheaper than repeated confiscations, arrests, and closure. Then you paid the public sector unofficially, or at least parts of it. Low-paid police could be bought to ignore the place, drink in the place, or tip off the owner before a raid. Not every officer took money, of course. Some raided aggressively. Some departments cooperated with federal agents. Eliot Ness later became famous precisely because he represented the opposite image, the incorruptible enforcer. But the public mythology around untouchables only makes sense because the default assumption had become touchable. Very touchable. That changed how a speakeasy chose location. A legal saloon before 1920 could maximize visibility. An illegal bar often maximized deniability and response time. Basement access, apartment fronts, back alleys, upper floors, restaurants with a second room. The point was not always to vanish. It was to buy enough minutes to move bottles, hide ledgers, or turn customers into guests at a private party before authorities crossed the threshold. And because owners, not customers, were usually the primary targets under the Volstead regime, the demand side remained unusually resilient. For the drinker, the risk was lower than for the seller. That matters economically. If the legal burden falls asymmetrically on supply, consumption can remain surprisingly sticky, which it did. One businessman later claimed there were 10 times more places to get a drink during Prohibition than before it. Hyperbole, maybe, but only maybe. So how did a middle-market speakeasy improve customer yield enough to cover those protection costs? By selling more than liquor. It sold permission. It sold novelty. It sold mixed-gender leisure. Before Prohibition, many saloons were male spaces. Speakeasies changed that. Historians of the era note that men and women now drank together in much larger numbers, and restaurants offering liquor often emphasized table service because women were less likely to sit alone at a bar in the older saloon model. That broadened the customer base immediately. A room that could pull couples, office workers, touring musicians, neighborhood regulars, and curious middle-class women had a much higher revenue ceiling than the old corner saloon. Music mattered for the same reason. Live jazz was not just atmosphere. It was price support. If the liquor was mediocre but the band was good and the room felt current, the customer stayed longer and spent more. The speakeasy was, in effect, bundling a weak product with stronger experiences. Very modern logic, actually. If the core good is compromised, differentiate the service. New York shows the scale of that transformation better than anywhere. Official estimates range from about 30,000 to 100,000 speakeasies in the city, and one often cited estimate for the late 1920s put the total around 32,000. Even the low estimate is extraordinary. Tens of thousands of illegal drinking places in one city. That means competition. Competition means segmentation. Not every speakeasy could be a glamorous nightclub. Most could not. Some were rough dives. Some were neighborhood joints. Some were jazz rooms. Some were restaurant back rooms. Some were private clubs in theory and commercial bars in practice. Once that many firms enter an illegal market, they stop being all the same business. And that leads to the third version of the model. The elite speakeasy. If the basement blind pig survived on volume and low expectations, the high-end club survived on margin. It did not need every drinker. It needed the right drinkers. Politicians, brokers, entertainers, wealthy tourists, people willing to pay for insulation and exclusivity. One contemporary description of Club Gallant in Greenwich Village captured the strategy almost perfectly. Exclusiveness was the club's great and only stock in trade. Scotch there was priced at $16 a bottle and champagne at $25 a bottle. $16, $25. In the 1920s. That was not just alcohol pricing. That was admission pricing disguised as a bottle list. The customer was paying for the fiction that he or she had entered a protected world, one rung above the ordinary dangers of prohibition. A better room, better music, better company, better odds, supposedly, that the liquor was real and the police would not crash through the wall before dessert. This is why elite speakeasies invested so heavily in access control. Passwords, membership cards, Selective doors. Doormen who recognized the socially desirable and filtered out the socially dangerous. That was not theater alone. It was loss prevention. A drunken, unknown customer could be an informant, a thief, an undercover investigator, or simply the kind of liability that attracted attention. In a legal bar, a difficult customer is a nuisance. In an illegal one, he can liquidate the enterprise. The elite market also had more stable ties to organized crime. Al Capone's organization in Chicago was estimated to make about $60 million a year supplying illegal beer and hard liquor to thousands of speakeasies in the late 1920s. In Harlem, Owney Madden's Cotton Club became one of the era's iconic venues. Sherman Billingsley turned the Store Club into a symbol of post-Prohibition nightlife, but got his start in the bootlegging world that Prohibition created. The point is not that every speakeasy was mob-run. Most were not. The point is that at the upper end, the line between hospitality and organized crime became very thin, because reliable supply and political shielding had themselves become premium goods. Here's the problem. Once the state criminalized alcohol at scale, it did not eliminate the market. It upgraded the value of anyone who could coordinate violence, bribery, transport, and distribution better than an ordinary bar owner could. The policy selected for syndicates that had consequences far beyond the bar tab. The homicide rate in the United States rose sharply in the Prohibition era, reaching about 10 per 100,000 in the 1920s, far above the first decade of the century. Historians still debate exact causal shares, and crime statistics from the period have limits. Fair enough, but there is no serious debate over the direction of pressure. A legal industry had been transformed into a criminal franchise system. Territory mattered more. Guns mattered more. Contract enforcement moved off the books and onto the street. And yet, from the perspective of pure business survival, a speakeasy owner did not need national stability. He needed local predictability. One supplier who delivered. One police contact who warned. One landlord who asked few questions. One bartender who kept quiet. One room full of customers willing to overpay for bad liquor because the alternative was drinking alone at home. That is what made the economics work night after night. By any conventional analysis, a large share of these places should have collapsed under uncertainty. They didn't, because the uncertainty was not random. It became routinized. The bribe became a scheduled expense. The raid became an operational hazard. The bottle quality issue became a menu design problem, solved with mixers and citrus. The weak point became the business model. That is the hidden mechanism. The successful speakeasy was not really selling alcohol. It was selling reliable access to alcohol under conditions of unreliable law. Reliability was the scarce product. Not whiskey, not gin. Reliability. Once you see that, a lot of strange details make sense at once. Why women became so important to the business. Why music mattered. Why so many bars emphasized food, dancing, or membership. Why hidden architecture could be a rational investment. Why diluted liquor still sold. Why better neighborhoods still tolerated illegal venues. Why gangsters, pharmacists, restaurateurs, and politicians all touched the same ecosystem. They were all monetizing the same premium, access under Prohibition. The human cost sat inside every one of those calculations. Not outside them. Inside them. If you ran a cheap place, the temptation was always there to save money on supply and let the customer absorb the risk. If you ran a busy place, the pressure was always there to pay off the next official rather than suspend operations. If you ran an elite club, the temptation was to believe the money insulated you from the violence beneath the floorboards. Sometimes it did. Sometimes it didn't. New York's municipal archives preserve hundreds of photographs of speakeasy murders, raids, bullet-riddled cars, and basement stills. The glamorous memory survives because the camera liked the parties. The files did not. And the suffering did not stop with poison whiskey. In 1930, a toxic adulterated product known as Ginger Jake crippled somewhere between 35,000 and 100,000 people with what became known as Jake leg, often leaving them with permanent neurological damage and a slow, unmistakable limp. Many of the victims were poor. Many were already priced out of safer liquor. That, too, was part of the speakeasy economy, even when it happened outside the club itself. Black markets sort people by risk tolerance, yes, but they also sort them by income. The poor drink the most dangerous substitutes first. Then came 1929. The Wall Street crash did not immediately end speakeasies, but it changed the political arithmetic around them. The federal government was now foregoing tax revenue from legal alcohol in the middle of economic collapse. Jobs tied to brewing, distilling, hospitality, and distribution looked less like moral contamination and more like missing employment. Prohibition enforcement had already become expensive. The Bureau of Prohibition's annual budget had risen from about $4.4 million to $13.4 million during the 1920s, while Coast Guard spending on prohibition averaged more than $13 million a year. Meanwhile, the market was still there. Still drinking. Still bribing. Still killing. Still poisoning. That is usually the moment when a policy loses its last layer of idealism. When the cost is no longer theoretical. Repeal came in 1933 with the 21st Amendment. And when legal liquor returned, not every speakeasy disappeared. Some adapted into legitimate bars and clubs. Some vanished because their only edge had been lawbreaking. Some owners could not survive once the black market premium disappeared and ordinary competition returned. That tells you something important. A speakeasy was not automatically a good bar. It was often just a bar optimized for illegality. So if you had opened a speakeasy in 1926 and wanted to make money, what would you actually have needed? Not just courage, not just a hidden room. You would have needed a dependable supplier in a distorted spirits market. You would have needed enough cash flow to absorb bribes, seizures, and sudden closures. You would have needed a customer mix that justified markups high enough to cover those risks. You would have needed to decide whether you were a volume dive, a neighborhood entertainment room, or an elite status club, because each one balanced supply, protection, and yield differently. And above all, you would have needed to know which part of the state could be evaded, which part could be paid, and which part could not. That was the actual economics of running a speakeasy. Not glamour, not rebellion. Risk pricing with a band in the corner. And the quiet warning in all of it is simple. When ordinary demand is outlawed, the market does not disappear. It migrates toward whoever can monetize secrecy, corruption, and human desperation most efficiently.